everyone. My name is Ella McSweeney and I'm a journalist here based in Ireland. And it's my pleasure to be with you this evening for the next hour for this conversation with Tom Philpott, US writer, farmer, and now author of his first book, Perilous Bounty. Now, Tom's work has been on my radar for many years now, back when he was blogging about farm and food politics while living on a small farm himself in North Carolina. And then afterwards for his work for Grist and Mother Jones. And I suppose what draws me to his work is that while his critique is devastating and troubling, it's never miserable. I think Tom has an ability to tell stories in a way that doesn't depress, but energizes and makes the reader hungry to find out more. And I think that's quite a feat, given the book that he has just written, which is, let's face it, about a disaster-bound food system. So we're going to be talking about his book and taking questions and comments from all of you. So please do get them in. Tom, it is great to connect with you over there in America.
Ella, thank you so much. I'm a big fan of your work as well. And I'm really excited to be talking to this international conference about my book, Perilous Bounty. And it is a book that focuses on the United States, but why I think it's so important to think about for a global audience is that the US model is a model that we hear in conventional ag development circles that should be imitated. It should be, we have sorted out the food problem in the United States. We've created this incredibly abundant food system, and other places are urged to mimic it. And so what I do in this book is I think I take a deep dive into the two main areas, the two biggest areas of food production in the US. And I show that the model is absolutely disastrous. And there really is not much about it that should be imitated. And so what I do is I focus on California, which is the place, the California Central Valley, which is the place that provides most of our fruits and vegetables, and a surging amount of things like almonds for the global market. They're very, very widely consumed in Europe and in China and other parts of Asia. So I focus on that area. And in the United States, it's the linchpin. It's the sort of place where if you go to a supermarket where fruits and vegetables come from. And I also look at the Midwestern Corn Belt, the prairie region and the sort of upper middle of the country, which is where we grow our grains, almost 100% fruits and vegetables for meat and biofuel. And I show that both of these regions are in a state of ecological unwinding. And one of the things I want to get across is that these are both incredibly precious areas. They're both, really jewels of food production, and we're abusing them. So in California, California is one of the world's biggest Mediterranean climates, which basically just means that it has very very long, hot summers and very mild winters, so very, very given to year-round food production. And like in most Mediterranean climates, water is a scarce factor. But what makes California so unique is that it's got this, it's got really two incredible resources. One is this spine of mountains that goes up the eastern edge of California called the Sierra Nevada. And it essentially collects all the weather coming from the South Pacific heading in that direction in the winter months. And basically these storms in the South Pacific come and fall as snow on the Sierra Nevada, and it creates this snowpack that creates this incredible resource that then cascades down the mountains and has been completely captured by dams and aqueducts and canals to deliver almost all of this water to farms. And so you get this, Mediterranean climate, and then this incredible water resource. And then there's a second water resource, and that is that before this was all dammed, that water flowed through the Central Valley, and a lot of it percolated down. And so you get these incredible aquifers, incredible reserves of groundwater. And so you've got these, you can think of it as a savings account where you can tap the groundwater when there are dry years, and then you've got water income coming through this the mountains, the snow melt, and so you get this sort of ideal place to grow food pretty much 12 months out of the year. The problem is that agriculture has gotten so big and so ravenous, and climate change has gotten, because of climate change, the snowpack is becoming increasingly erratic. It's both the snowpack is both falling in terms of it's declining, and also sometimes there's way too much of it. There's way too much weather coming in the winter, and you get mega storms. But the sort of main problem facing California right now is that agriculture has gotten so ravenous for water and so big that it essentially is sucking dry the aquifer. And if you listen to climate science, you'll see that essentially the snowpack, if things continue as they are, is going to disappear. You're going to get most years with no snowpack, and some years with incredible mega storms. And so the situation in California that has been ideal for growing food for a century is very rapidly changing, and we're going to have to do something different in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's terribly interesting, your book, Tom, because you explore these two very fascinating and relevant geographical areas, California, as you say, and the Midwest, and maybe we can definitely talk a bit more about both those areas. But one of the things that I found interesting was, I suppose if it is one theme that unites the crises that you've teased out in this book, it's this idea of simplification and specialization.
Yes.
And you write about it having its roots in this concept of comparative advantage that you start at the beginning of this book. And I feel like this concept dating back to the 1700s is a really important idea to understand within the broader context of what you're saying. Can you talk a little bit about where this idea came from, how it relates to food and farming, and also why, in your words, you say that its apparent triumph is, quote, like the sight of water in a sun-baked desert, a mirage and a dangerous one for US eaters?
Yeah, so it's a really simple concept, and it basically comes from Ricardo, the British economist, and it's this idea that every place should specialize on what it does best and then trade for other things. And so, for example, why should we grow food here in North Carolina, where I am, when California has this incredible comparative advantage I just described? It's got this Mediterranean climate, it's got this these incredible water resources. And so why should small farms in North Carolina fuss around with growing food? Why should we devote land to food in North Carolina when California is so great at this? And I think that there's nothing wrong with the concept itself, but what happens is that you get these very, very narrow definitions, and there's this tendency to not think about restraints. And so, California's comparative advantage in food and agriculture assumes that this water resource will last forever, that it can be, that basically climate change doesn't exist, that there's endless amounts of water in these aquifers to be drawn down, this essentially fossil resource. And so that becomes a problem with it. And I think that we see that on the global scale as well. A place like Haiti was assured by American policymakers, oh, don't worry about food production. We can, you can get, let's say, rice. The United States overproduces rice. We will send you, we will sell you on the global market as much rice as you want. Maybe you should move to an economy that produces cheap factory goods and try to compete with China, let's say, in manufacturing. And then, of course, what happens is you get Haiti priced out of the food market. You've destroyed or greatly reduced its agricultural capacity and made it subjected to the food market, and then people starve. And so I think that building redundancy into these systems, and also including other factors beside, digging a little bit deeper into comparative advantage and the various factors at play becomes super important.
You write a bit about the residents of, excuse my pronunciation if it's wrong, is it Alpol? The residents that are mainly farm workers supplying labor for the surrounding nut growers, and yet this crazy, terrifying situation that they found themselves in, that they couldn't drink the water for their own families that flowed through their taps, even as the nut groves were expanding. Can you talk a bit about that situation and the people that you met there?
Yeah, so I think that that one of the key themes of the book is that where this sort of US model of agriculture alights, where it gets really powerful, where it gets really productive, essentially destroys living conditions for the people that live there. And I think that's a great warning to anyone who around the world who hears this idea that we've got to industrialize our agriculture like the United States. It's like, what zones are you willing to sacrifice? And if you go, the Central Valley is where this town Alpa is. It's in the southern Central Valley. And it's a classic Central Valley town in that most of the residents in this area are farm workers, most of them immigrants from Mexico and Central America. And they work in these almond groves. And the almond industry, one of the reasons why it's so attractive is that it's not very labor intensive at all. It's incredibly mechanized. So you get a couple of times a year, there's pruning, and then the harvest, which is very mechanized, where you need labor. And so it actually has given rise to increased unemployment throughout the valley and massive reduction in wages and living conditions because of it. And then, so what happens is that when there's a drought, as there was from 2011 to 2016, since there's none of this snow melt coming through, there's this reversion to the pump and this incredible well drilling frenzy, bigger and bigger wells going deeper and deeper into the ground. And the water, the level of the aquifer drops. And as it gets toward the bottom, it becomes incredibly rich in a lot of minerals, many of which are poisonous. And in the case of Alpa in that area, and this is true throughout many regions in the Central Valley, it becomes incredibly rich in arsenic. And so you have a town where people are making, essentially the median income is at or below the US poverty level. And they can't drink the running water because it's contaminated with arsenic. And so you have people spending thousands of dollars a year, a large portion of their income, buying water. And then, the thing that really got me when I visited in the middle of the drought was people in the town had, in these, very modest houses that they're living in, had little yards, and there were people who had fruit trees in their gardens, providing food for them. And they were told that they could not water these fruit trees because of drought conditions. But agriculture at that time, and still to a degree, was completely unregulated. So you go and you hear people have to buy water because they can't drink the tap water. They can't water the fruit trees. And then you go a mile out of town, and as far as the eye can see, there are pistachio and almond groves going in, committing the region to 20 or 30 years of water use, and wells going in without regulation. And it's just stunning. And I should add that in addition to the water being fouled in the area, some of the worst air in the country, the air in the Central Valley is worse than the air in Los Angeles in terms of fine particulate matter and a lot of other pollutants, largely because of agriculture, dairy, massive dairy operations, and also this being the US, of course, we combine oil production with food production. There's massive amounts of oil production in the southern Central Valley, and that also fouls the air. So the area is essentially unlivable for people, even though millions of people are living there.
Tom, can I jump out from California and into, very briefly, your own background? I mean, one of the reasons that I've always found your work so engaging is that you have a background as a financial journalist, and you're thinking as a food and agriculture writer comes as much from economics as it does from anything else. And I think it was around 2004 that you moved from New York City to North Carolina. You started to farm at that time, and two things that might have been separate in your head began to combine, this idea of politics and finance and food and farming. And I just wonder, how much has that influenced your own writing in this particular book as well, this kind of perspective and expertise that you have as a financial journalist in the past?
Yeah, so I was a financial journalist, and I, at that time I was thinking a lot about, I saw my time in the trenches of financial journalism in New York as learning about how capital and finance work. I was never a believer in any of that stuff, but I wanted to see how it worked from the inside, and so that gave me a set of tools to then apply to agribusiness. And so I was able to think about these giant companies that control the food system, that really just sort of provide all the inputs to farmers, like seeds and chemicals and fertilizers and pesticides, and also buy their products and turn them into meat and ethanol. I was able to see just, how those companies work, how they function, and look at the sort of value chain and ask the question, who benefits from this system? And I think that time spent sort of analyzing companies and thinking about the stock market and valuations and all of that really did help inform my view of things. And it ends up, from where I'm sitting, it ends up being a very devastating critique of how all that works. If you ask the question, who benefits from this system, the answer inevitably becomes mostly the shareholders in these companies, and not very many other people.
Yeah, obviously, your book is called Perilous Bounty, and it raises that question of who cashes in on that bounty. And it is time and time again within the book that you give the examples that it isn't most of the farmers, it certainly isn't the farm workers, it isn't the public who buy the food. It is a very small handful of large companies who capture the profit. And indeed, it's not only that the farmers aren't cashing in, but they're suffering their own kind of economic slaughter. I know in North Carolina, where you were farming for a while, if you look at the explosion of, we'll say, pig production, it came hand in hand with the death of a lot of pig farming and big pig farmers in that area.
That's right. And also, I think another really important point about North Carolina is that there was a system of essentially a supply management system for tobacco. I should say, first of all, that the racial dynamics of farming in North Carolina are as rotten and horrific as anywhere else in the United States or in the South. That essentially black farmers after abolition, emancipation, Reconstruction, they were able to get a foothold in the land, by 1920. And in the century since then, that foothold has been completely taken away by racist policies and racist economic decisions. But on top of that, there was, including for black farmers, there was a tobacco allotment. It was essentially a supply management system that when there was a massive settlement with tobacco companies because their products killed people 15 or so years ago, basically the companies negotiated the end of that supply management system, sending North Carolina agriculture into crisis, massive crisis throughout North Carolina. And hog farming and these giant hog CAFOs, these giant hog operations where farmers on contract supply these enormous companies, mostly Smithfield in our area, basically proliferated through in the wake of the collapse of tobacco farming. Basically, those companies had to buy a portion of their tobacco from the United States. That was taken away. The allotment was taken away. They started buying a lot from Brazil and other places. And so tobacco prices tumbled, and this horrific hog farming took over in North Carolina. And it's another sacrifice zone. It's another region where you can't drink the water. The air is really bad. And in North Carolina, these are, if you look at a map of the density of enslaved people at the time of the Civil War, let's say 1860, and a map of the density of these hog operations, they almost completely overlap. And so it's basically a massive example of environmental injustice.
Moving into Iowa, which is the second big area, the Midwest, the Corn Belt, big area that you write about, and with their monocultures of soy and corn, which then subsequently feed the pig factories. I mean, can you take, for people like me who've never been there before, can you take us back to the 1850s, white settlers who would have showed up there? What kind of landscape would they have found? And clearly it must have been so very different from what exists there now.
Yeah, so just as California is this incredible example of the Mediterranean climate, just this, really kind of unique or almost unique landscape. The Corn Belt centered in Iowa, that landscape is one of the globe's great grasslands. It's one of the places where they tend to be in the center of continents. There's one in Ukraine. There is one in the Argentine Pampas is another example where you get these temperate climates that have these incredible grasslands. And in the case of the Midwest, high grass prairies with incredible diversity of grasses and legumes in the ground, massive stores of topsoil. And something else that it has in common in California that I didn't know as much until I dove into the book is also incredible acreages of wetlands, areas that were, basically, underwater for most of the year, incredible wetland ecosystems that also stored, both of these wetlands and prairie lands all stored incredible amounts of carbon, just unthinkable amounts of carbon, and were engines of biodiversity. Just incredible populations of birds and all sorts of megafauna on the ground. And then also, Native American populations essentially managing the area and maintaining the area. And obviously very famous, huge populations of bison were there. And so it was, it's really hard for an American to imagine it because it's almost all gone. The wetlands have been drained. The prairie has been plowed. There's 1% of prairie land original prairie land in Iowa that still exists. I haven't laid eyes on it in my trips. I think there's a couple of places you can go to see like a patch of it. And it is an incredibly transformed landscape. It's got to be one of the most transformed landscapes in the world. And in the book, I compare it to a city like, imagine New York City before contact. Imagine Mexico City, even before original settlements happened there long time ago. And then you come to now. The landscape in Iowa is just as transformed as that. And it's stunning and startling that it's essentially two crops, corn and soybeans, has replaced this incredible biodiversity. And on top of corn and soybeans, there are these same kind of hog factories that we're talking about in North Carolina, even more of them in Iowa. And also this, stunning amount of egg production in these giant factory cages it's by far the biggest egg producer in the United States. And that's basically what it has become, the entire area. And the draining of the wetlands is just something that is startling, because the way they did it is with these underground pipes that are called tiles. And essentially these tiles have become pipelines for transferring agrochemicals to people's water. The amount of water pollution that goes on in the Midwest, in the American Midwest, is absolutely stunning. The water is full of nitrates and pesticides, and this sort of water infrastructure, this sort of drainage infrastructure, is one of the key drivers of that.
And I suppose what isn't lost in your writing, and while it is important not to dwell on the past too much, because I suppose the critical issue here is about what we can do and what can happen in the future, I think what isn't lost in your writing is a respect for the past and an understanding of what would have been the case of the landscape itself and what would now be unrecognizable to, as you mentioned, Native Americans around 1850s and all the rest. And I was very struck, Tom, by your acknowledgements at the end of your book. And I just wanted to ask you about your late father, because you say he taught me to take the past seriously, question arbitrary authority, and stick up for the underdog. Your book does this in spades, but I'm interested in this idea of taking the past seriously in the context of farming. And I wonder, with farming in particular, if the moves have always been so consistently about onward in the future to deny the thousands of years of farming that have existed and the skills of farmers that have built up towards a kind of utopia of technological innovation, chemical usage, specialization, and the rest, a kind of never look back attitude. And I wonder, would you recognize that lack of respect? And do you think that lack of respect may have contributed to the problems that we now find ourselves in?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And you'll often hear critics of mine or critics of industrial agriculture will often say that people criticizing industrial agriculture want to restore 19th century farming or something like that, or go back to the sort of a pre-lapsarian past that never existed. And I think that that the problem with that is that it ends up being a kind of solutionism, and the solutions continue to generate more problems. And I think the example par excellence would be the move to synthetic nitrogen as this solution to the nutrient. There's this whole the central challenge of farming is replenishing the soil, right? I mean, that's what farming is it's always been about, figuring out how to replenish the soil. And synthetic nitrogen takes that problem away. It's just you burn some natural gas or coal and create nitrogen. And I think that has triggered all kinds of problems that we're just now trying to figure out. And a respect for how that was done in the past. We don't have to restore it, but a respect for how it was done in the past. We can learn from it and create something new without just completely acting like the past farming techniques were somehow just stupid and uninformed and brutal. I think that is a big part of our problem.
I suppose we want to move on soon to the solutions, because a big part of your book is talking about these solutions, the need for mid-sized farming and the need to look at farmers who are doing it in a way that is better for the environment and also for themselves. But I just wanted to finally ask you a little bit about the sort of global perspective, and I suppose what's perilous, as you write about for these farmers, is that they sell into this global market, that the, as you call it, the Corn Belt style agriculture that has taken root in other countries, in Brazil and Ukraine and in Argentina, it has left the choices increasingly diminished in terms of who they can sell to. So, I mean, it is extraordinary. You give an example of grain traders being a very elite bunch. I mean, there's three buyers control 80%, 87% of the market. And you would wonder, what chance would any farmer have in that environment?
Yeah, so I just go through how basically this sort of hyper focus on corn and soybeans and a couple of products like pork and eggs in the Midwest has led to this kind of wholesale slaughter of farmers. We see a steady decline since the rise of industrial agriculture of farmers in the Midwest. It's ongoing today. There are continue to be mid-sized farmers. There really aren't to speak of. I mean, there are small farmers in the Midwest, but they're very few. And mid-sized farmers continue to go out of business and get consolidated into ever bigger operations. And so, I was just thinking about it with my economic hat on, and thinking about how, well, since there are fewer farmers in the Midwest, at least maybe they get some leverage because there are fewer of them. They're not as, they don't have as many competitors who are growing just corn and soybeans. But then I thought about how, well, actually, that's not the case at all, because even as their numbers are shrinking, the same set of companies, input suppliers like Bayer and Corteva, which is the US combination of Dow and DuPont, and grain traders like you were just mentioning, they're also hard at work in places like Argentina and Brazil. And the Brazilian case and the Brazilian Cerrado is particularly tragic. Well, I think that the Argentine case is tragic too, because this is an area that has been farmed sustainably for a very long time, rotating beef through pastures, and doing various things with biodiversity that create a really high quality food and also preserve the soil. That is being changed over to US monocrop corn and soybean production, oftentimes with 2 crops a year. The Midwest of the United States, we have these long, cold winters that you can't do that in. And then in the Cerrado, you're taking what has been considered by European colonizers as a wasteland. The Cerrado is this vast region, and I think it's half the size of Europe or something in Brazil, that was considered a wasteland by the Portuguese colonizers. But U.S. industrial agriculture in the sort of face in the sort of figure of Norman Borlaug and his crew figured out that if you add lime and industrial fertilizer to the land, it actually becomes productive. And so we're in the midst right now of this incredible conversion of this incredibly biodiverse savanna, more biodiverse than the U.S. Midwest, also very huge stores of carbon. And the research I did in my book suggested that we're converting savanna land to corn and soybeans it's an ongoing process, and it's essentially bringing 2 Los Angeles, United States, full of cars into the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so that land is being converted at a huge scale to corn and soybeans. And so the U.S. Farmers, even as they consolidate, have ever less leverage because they have these competitors growing the exact same products and actually higher quality. The protein content of Brazilian soybeans is actually higher than the protein content of U.S. soybeans. And then you've got Ukraine is in the process of doing the same thing. And so you've got this these global nodes of, I think my book just focuses on the US, but it's part of a global system that is driving these areas into ruin, much like the Midwest is being driven into ruin. And I think social movements is, it's basically going to be the job of social movements to say stop, to say we can't do this anymore. And that, basically the corn and soybeans grown there are going into giant hog production facilities in China. But is cheap pork, is it really something that the world needs? And I think the answer is no. There are other ways to create a diet than based on cheap, destructive grain-fed meat. And so I think that's going to be a big challenge. And I hope my book dramatized why it is such a destructive system.
And looking towards the kind of solutions, I mean, how should we feed ourselves? How should we farm? I mean, this in some way no more important question at the moment and trying to work that out. But I just wonder, before we start talking about some of the remarkable farmers that you did speak to and in your profile in your book, we hear about the US and the moves in terms of the big tech companies trying to break them up and reduce this kind of monopolistic situation in tech. And I just wonder, is it possible to even begin to talk about good ways of farming when you have, as you have put forward, this immense control by the processors of the food system, in essence? I mean, is it time to find a way to talk about not allowing that control to exist anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I sort of landed in my book. I mean, every book like mine that sort of lays out these enormous, terrifying problems has to have a solution section, and it was very challenging. And where I ended up landing was that this system is so propped up by government policy. Government policy is, and I think in Europe you might have a similar thing with the European Union and its system of farm payments. That the real, I mean, we can talk about, and Ella, you wrote a beautiful article about a farm in Ireland that is similar to the farms, and maybe even more dramatically, based on biodiversity in the farms I talk about. And we can write about those forever, but I have the sense that they're going to be the exception and not the rule until we transform the policy framework. And where I am, from where I'm sitting here in the U.S., that is going to take a massive social movement, a concerted social movement effort, because we just we think we've pushed away a really horrible presidential regime in the United States. It's almost happened. It's going to be a couple of weeks. But the new regime, which in many ways is a breath of fresh air, has hired a guy to run the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which sort of oversees our food policy system, named Tom Vilsack, who's very much a creature of the same kind of thinking. And to me, that shows just how far we are as a social movement. And I look over at climate activism and environmental justice activism as being very inspiring models. And we've seen both of those things rise up in the United States. And I am really hoping, and I've seen it to an extent, but I want to see to a greater extent those movements incorporating food into their critiques. And I think that we're going to have to, this is when you have a very profitable industry that collects the profits of something as massive as food production, then they take some of their profits and they invest it in things like lobbying and campaign finance. And we are a very long way. Kicking Trump out is just one step of a very long journey to getting the kind of policy that rewards biodiversity, and just the whole principle, as you put it in your article. I think the phrase, well, I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like life draws life. Like when you have a biodiverse farm, it draws positive biodiversity. And having a food policy and a farm policy that is based on that principle is going to take massive social movement uprising against these moneyed interests.
And I wonder, Tom, do you have any insight or understanding as to why that hasn't happened? Because as brilliant as your book is, you are most certainly not the first writer to talk about these issues. I mean, back in the 70s, there were books coming out, and you mentioned Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America. And yet, food being such a central part of all our lives, we have not seen, I think it's fair to say, we have not seen that. And certainly in America, you haven't had that sense of real social unrest when it comes to food, in the same way that, for example, recently with Black Lives Matter, you may have had. It seems to have inhabited perhaps a more elite section of agri-intellectuals who have said, I don't know, like buy better or spend more money on your food, but it doesn't quite cut it, does it?
Yes, that is a really excellent point. And I've been thinking a lot about what's happening now in India, where you've got a mass movement of farmers that are pushing back on neoliberal reforms by Prime Minister Modi. And they're pushing back in, very active fashion. And I think one of the problems here in the US, and I can't really speak to the European situation, but one of the problems here in the US is that that essentially we have eviscerated our, let's call it, peasant economy, that essentially the rise of industrial agriculture and the success of industrial agriculture at pushing out farms and farmers and consolidating farmers and farms, where we go from, I think, 5 million farms to less than, way less than 2 million farms in the span of about a century, means that we don't have you go across the border and go into Mexico. There's a very powerful peasant movement in Mexico that is at the center of their sort of food conversations and food policy fights. And in America, we have a couple of smallholder farmer groups. There's a Via Campesina chapter in the United States. There's a National Family, the National Family Farmer Coalition, but we don't have the numbers. And so, our small and mid-sized farm base has been so eviscerated that it is left to people like Michael Pollan. And I think, Wendell Berry was an example of someone writing from a small farm from that perspective in a lot of ways. But there are so few people in his position that I think it sort of cuts the legs out from under our social movement. And that's why I've been so inspired by, the climate activism of organizations like 350.org that have challenged giant pipelines going in successfully. And that's what I take. I think it's gonna, obviously we're not gonna regrow a peasant base that's gonna go do a tractor march on Washington and shut the streets down until things change. It's just not gonna happen. And so I do take hope from things like the climate justice movement.
I also wonder about manual labor and who will be doing the manual labor and who wants to do the manual labor. I was very struck by your the beginning of your book, and you said that when you were on your farm, you said, we had a joke at the small organic farm in the Appalachian Mountains where I worked in the early 2000s, when the pain has finally eased because your fingers have gone completely numb. Way through the morning's harvest, when you're talking about harvesting salad leaves, the daily ache was worth it, and I'm quite sure it was. They sound delicious, but I wonder, is it a fantasy, this idea of small and medium-sized farms, because there isn't enough people who are willing to do the manual labor anymore?
I mean, I think that really, I think, is the big question going forward, and I think I will probably be doing some writing about that going forward. But I think a lot of it has to do with the ownership model. Like, basically, if you're willing to do that kind of work and get down and harvest the salad greens like that, then you probably either have an ownership stake in the farm, or you're absolutely desperate and you'll take whatever wage you can get. And that's the situation we have in the United States with almost all food and farm labor in the United States is people who have no other choice. Yes. No one would choose to go work in an industrial scale poultry factory in the middle of a pandemic for $12 an hour, which is essentially a poverty wage in the United States. It's sort of a function of economic desperation. And I think one thing I'm really encouraged about right now, and it's especially among young African American farmers, is this push to cooperative models and figuring out cooperative models that expand ownership and move us away from this sort of fantasy of a single owner of a farm, a family farm that's going it alone, which doesn't work in the United States. You're either going to get really big or you're going to get out, and you're going to get really mechanized, and you're going to exploit labor ruthlessly, or you're going to exit the business. Coming up with cooperative models that can pay a decent wage, and then also, I think that there is appropriate technology challenges that can make a lot of the work of that kind of work that I talked about in the book a lot easier and a lot less damaging. There are, most of the sort of investment in research and development in technology in farming in the past 100 years has been industrial scale agriculture. But someone like Elliot Coleman, who farms up in Maine, has created these little machines that can make stuff like harvesting a lot easier and on a pittance. But if we ask people at, let's say, the university close to where our farm was, Appalachian State University, hey, do research. Here's the challenge of getting these greens out of the field in pristine fashion. Here's what they're doing now. If that became the problem, then you could make that kind of work less brutal. So I think appropriate technology is one of the answers, and also figuring out a new ownership model, and that where people are maybe making a salary instead of getting paid based on what they can get from the market. And I think moving to those kinds of models, and we think about like, well, maybe government support could be a part of that, could be a part of ensuring decent wages for farm workers if the market's not doing it. And then the pushback would be, oh, well, that would be socialism. Well, of course, we're putting anywhere between $5 and $25 billion a year in agriculture, just in agriculture subsidies every year in the United States. That's a pot of money that could be freed up. There are other ways we could do it. But I think that sort of revaluing farm labor is a key challenge. And I think that in the end, it's going to be policy, government support, and also new ownership models, figuring out cooperative models that, basically like, what if farms became worker-owned cooperatives? What if we push that out on a larger scale? And the energy that I see around that is coming from young African-American farmers in the United States, and it's really, really encouraging.
We're getting a lot of questions and comments in, and I want to get to them. I just want to very briefly ask you about politics and the Green New Deal. I mean, obviously, you have in the Ocasio-Cortez and Markey Green New Deal, you have this sense of an upswell of grassroots support for policies that may not be feasible top down, but this sense of generating, as you've already said, the energy from people themselves. I just wonder how or could it deliver for a new food system as you see it and as you see it's required?
Well, I wrote that section of the book at a very special time in the United States when it was just not that long ago, when two candidates, one named Bernie Sanders and one named Elizabeth Warren, had a real shot at winning the Democratic nomination. That window closed very rapidly, not long after I finished, kind of classic author's dilemma. And the regime, the Biden regime with Tom Vilsack as USDA chief, I think on the climate front, there are some levers to push with Biden. And I think just driving home the point that food is part of food. The food question and the climate question are not separable. They're the same question in the end. How are we going to have a livable planet going forward? And I feel like the Green New Deal process has essentially stalled with the at least for now, with the rise of President Biden. But I think that the social movement pressure can continue for it, and putting food at the center of it is going to be really important. And one thing that we've learned in the past 5 years is that the climate crisis is not stopping. It's not slowing down. It's accelerating. There are going to be more climate shocks to come, probably in 2021. California could be already moving into another drought right now. We could have storms in a couple of months here that, like I document in the book, send untold massive amounts of soil off of farms and into streams this coming season. And I think that there is a lot of potential for the climate movement, for the food justice movement to act on those crises and push for change. Unfortunately, we don't have someone in the White House who is quite ready to hear that, and Congress is it's going to be really divided in Congress. But I'm really excited about social movements in the United States right now.
I mean, obviously, Vilsack has been there before under Obama, and I just wonder briefly, Tom. I mean, Obama's farm policy was not particularly good in seeing the opportunity that if you get food policy right, you will get climate change right, you'll get biodiversity problems right, you'll get potentially communities and community cohesion right as well. Seeing the world through the prism of food and farm policy is a very powerful way to try and solve these greater problems, because as you say, they're also interlinked. And I just wonder, why do you think that Obama himself didn't seem to understand the power of using food as a way to drive change that is so clearly needed and in the public interest when it comes to things like climate change, biodiversity, and empowerment at local level, and healthier food and all the rest?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think he did understand. He actually ran in 2007, 2008 on a pretty progressive food platform. He was against these giant hog factories that were fouling up communities in places like Iowa. He ran on that in Iowa. He mounted a challenge early in his administration against these hyper consolidated monopolies that run the food system. He read Michael Pollan's books and had conversations with Michael Pollan. So he got it. And then when he got into office, I mean, I think the original sin was hiring Vilsack, who was a governor of Iowa and a champion of ethanol and a champion of agricultural biotechnology. And I think I think he did that with the conventional wisdom that if I'm gonna maintain my hold in the Midwest, I've got to get a Midwestern politician to run agriculture. And then I think we just saw the power of these lobbies and these giant corporations and their dollars that they spend in Washington. And he, like any president, he had to choose his battles. And he completely threw his hands up on that one and chose other battles. And Biden picking Vilsack, I mean, it was sort of the second time as farce kind of a situation that he seems to be doing the same thing. But I think events may have different ideas for him. I think because of climate activism, I think he may not be able to do what Obama did and just sort of lay down that one.
Okay, so I want to go through some of the questions, Tom. There's quite a few. The first one in relation to that, Tom, do you believe that the change to the Biden administration will result in any significant changes in support policies and practices, given Biden's belief in human-influenced climate change, and what might they be?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is a major deal to have a regime in there that understands that climate change is happening and is a real thing that has to be dealt with. I'm afraid in terms of agriculture, the way that they're thinking about it is a carbon market and essentially funneling money in some sort of cap and trade scheme into practices that we're not really sure about yet what they will be, but to pay farmers for certain practices. And what I fear is that well, first of all, the market price of carbon isn't high enough to make farmers change their policies. And one thing that I did a lot of reporting back in 2009, there was a major climate legislation called the Waxman Markey bill that I reported on. And the scheme that was being cooked up for agriculture was essentially paying farmers for a lot of what they're already doing, which essentially is a form of no-till agriculture in the Midwest that relies on herbicides to kill weeds and doesn't really sequester carbon. And I think there's been a lot more research since then that shows that it doesn't sequester carbon. And my fear is that a lot of that money, there will be an impulse to shunt a lot of that money into propping up the current system. And I think that's where we are now without social movements. I mean, I think there will be some changes at the margins, and some of the just rank stupidity of the Trump administration will be corrected, but the ship will continue. This giant ship that needs a lot to move in a new direction will continue generally in the same direction until something changes. And if he had chosen a reformer, someone open to new ideas, a lot of us were thinking he might choose Marcia Fudge, who's a representative out of Ohio, who doesn't have this history that that Biden has. I think we would be a lot more optimistic about the direction, but right now I think we're essentially in a stasis until we get a lot more social movement activity.
Reminds me of something an Irish farmer told me leaning over a gate down in the west of Ireland once, which is agriculture is a big ship and big ships are very hard to turn around.
Exactly.
Another question, Tom, this is a nice question. Tom, what gives you most hope at the moment? Who or what in food and farming inspires you?
You know, I have been doing some work on this movement of African American and Native American farmers the past year, and the amount of energy in that sphere is just incredible right now. And I think that that folks experimenting, I mean, because what's happening with African American farmers is that because African Americans have been kicked off the land, they are essentially having to fight for a foothold in the land. And in doing so, they're confronting these economic problems that we see, these pressures to get really big and to use chemicals. And they're experimenting with new models of making it work with biodiverse systems and experimenting with new ownership models and cooperatives. So I take a lot of hope from that. And I also take hope from, if you had asked me 7 or 8 years ago, we've got these giant pipeline situations here in the United States that are would be huge investments in infrastructure to move fossil fuels to market and endanger land. A lot of it in Native American territory, and it's just on its face a disastrous idea with climate change looming. And we've seen 2 major pipelines get stopped. Now, part of that was because oil prices dropped, but they would not have been stopped without massive social movement action from Native American groups, from groups like 350.org. And that kind of climate action, I think, is a palette that we can all get excited about moving forward. So I would say right now, those are the 2 things that are giving me the most hope.
And there's a few questions mentioning regenerative agriculture. It's a term, certainly here in Ireland, we've heard a surge of interest in this. And I have to admit, it still makes me a bit twitchy, the idea of regenerative agriculture. I'm not sure exactly yet how to understand it, but I just wonder what your sense of it is and whether you would hold a lot of hope in the idea of it.
I do. I mean, I think it's a fine concept, and it's basically I think if you want to really sort of get to the definition of it or what the definition should be, it's farming practices that aren't just don't have bulk food production as the final goal, but maintaining ecosystems and bolstering ecosystems with food as a byproduct almost. And I think they can be incredibly productive. I mean, it's just essentially using biodiversity as working with biodiversity instead of against biodiversity. And I think that it is the answer. I think with the term, we have a lot of corporations in the United States jumping in and trying to grab the banner of it. And I think that there is some overselling of the carbon benefits, the sort of ability to store carbon in soil to offset climate change. I think that has been oversold a little bit, but what has not been oversold and I think has been undersold is the ability of truly regenerative agriculture that bolsters ecosystems in making us resilient to climate change. Because systems that are managed like that, like the farm you profiled in Ireland or the 2 farms that I profiled in Iowa, they're storing more carbon in the soil, and that's great. I don't know if they can offset the massive fossil fuel based transportation system and the factory system and everything that we are doing wrong. But what they can do is keep food production going as droughts and really, really fierce storms and hurricanes and things like that are set to increase. They can help us maintain food production and keep it going during this inevitable climate chaos that's coming our way. But I do want to keep a skeptical eye out on corporations trying to grab the banner. My suspicion always is, are you trying to actually shake things up, or are you trying to maintain the status quo and get a little bit of, get a little bit of green cred in the process? And I think that's, as journalists, is something that we have to be keep our eyes out for.
Indeed. So we have this opportunity. We can jump into a Zoom. There's a few more questions here, Tom, if you would like, or we can, if we can put the Zoom link up, then we can share it with everyone.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that if you are.
Do that if you wouldn't mind, because I don't have a copy. I only have a PDF of your book. Can you hold your book up again, just so people are at the cover of it?
Yes, and apparently there's a bookstore that you can where you can get it, and it's hard to get in the UK right now, but hopefully it'll be coming soon. But thank you so much for this.
Thanks so much, and we're gonna jump into a Zoom now to address more of those questions. So if people want to join us there. Do we have a link that we can share with people? Has it already happened? There we go. There. Okay.
All right. Jumping over now. Thank you so much, Ella. Thank you, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you so much.